everybody. Welcome to another live stream History Value podcast. Today, Dr. Helen Bond joins me. In the last interview, we discussed her book, the Gospel of Mark. I'll leave a link to that description below. And today, we're talking about her book, The Historical Jesus, a guide for the perplexed. Welcome back to History Value podcast, Dr. Bond.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here, Jacob.
Excellent. So let's get started. What kind of methodology, if you could describe it, that is used to understand the historical Jesus based on the text that we currently possess?
I suppose it's what you call a fairly straightforward historical methodology. It's what most people doing ancient history would tend to do. So some historical Jesus scholars have what they call various criteria, and they're to do with things that are a little bit unlike things in the background of Judaism or the later church, or things that cohere with what you've already decided is a fairly general or something that's likely to be true, or something that might work in Aramaic. But those have come under quite a lot of criticism in recent years. So what I tend to do, and I think what most historical Jesus people nowadays, or at least the majority of historical Jesus people do, is tend to use fairly standard historical criteria. So for example, we're looking at the age of our sources. The older sources are going to be the most reliable, and that would be the letters of Paul. And then you're looking at Mark and a hypothetical document called Q, which it's believed lay behind Matthew and Luke. And we don't know the date, but obviously it predates both of those works. And you're going to give less credence then to later sources, or sources that seem to be based on too many earlier sources. So looking at the date, also if we have anything from people who aren't followers, because obviously one of the difficulties when it comes to Jesus is that most of the sources come from followers of Jesus, and so of course they're not neutral. They're writing from a position of faith. So if we have sources like Josephus, a Jewish historian from the late 1st century, or Tacitus, Suetonius from the early 2nd century, then again, those are important sources to bring into the discussion.
If you had to give a date to the hypothetical Q document, when do you think it was most likely composed?
I think we just don't know. I mean, there's quite a lot of people nowadays saying, "Oh, it comes from the 50s. It's from Galilee," and people start to work out this whole kind of community, or this whole sort of situation of Q. All we know about it is that it predates Matthew and Luke. So it may also be after the fall of the temple. We don't know. Most people would date it before, but again, it's not. I mean, given that we don't even have the document, and what we have is hypothetical. I mean, I think it's very likely. I am a Q believer, but I just don't think we can be sure that it dates from the 50s. It may not be much different in time period to Mark's gospel.
Do you think that there could have been lost Hebrew sources about Jesus as well? Because scholars discuss the church fathers often mentioning a Hebrew gospel or a Hebrew gospel of Matthew that was lost and we don't have today as having existed.
It's possible, yeah. I mean, Papias in the early 2nd century talks about Matthew composing in the Hebrew language some of the sayings of Jesus. It's quite possible that people started writing some stories down, or collections of sayings. Probably those get lost because they get incorporated into other documents. So when we have Q, which is a collection of sayings, any older sayings, perhaps written in Hebrew, would have been translated into Greek, which is what Q seems to be in. And then perhaps it just gets lost because, nobody needs that old collection of sayings anymore because they've got a bigger, more substantial collection instead. Or maybe something in Hebrew and Aramaic gets passed around at first, but then as the Christian groups are more and more Greek speakers, then again those older documents just sort of fall to the wayside, and it's the Greek ones that tend to get copied and used. So I think it's quite possible that there were written things. Obviously, literacy rates were very, very low in the ancient world. You're only talking about 10 to 15%. So it's not as though everybody in those crowds would have gone home and written a journal or even written letters to one another. It's not common to be writing, but not impossible that some people started writing things down and that they passed these stories around and people wrote them down because they wanted copies of them.
When you look at the nativity stories of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, and based on the other material that we do have, when do you think Jesus was most probably born?
I'd say around about the year 0, if we had one. I guess it's 1 BCE, 1 CE seems the most likely. Again, we don't know, but the story in Matthew suggests that it's 6 BCE because it's a couple of years before the death of Herod the Great, and we know that Herod died in 4 BCE, so that's roughly about 6 BCE. In Luke, though, he dies roughly about 6 CE because that's when the census took place. In Luke's story, the census is being taken under Quirinius, and everybody has to go down to Bethlehem or their ancestral home to be registered. So yeah, there's about 12 years between those two dates, perhaps somewhere in the middle, but we don't know. One of the interesting things too, I always think about our earliest gospel, Mark, is that he doesn't give us any indication as to how old Jesus was. It's Luke who later on says he was about 30, but that's a bit vague. So maybe Jesus was about 30, or maybe he's 20 or 40. We just don't really know. But sometime around about the change of the eras, I think is probably as reasonable as we can be.
And how long would you say that Jesus' ministry lasted?
Again, that's a difficult one. People usually pit Mark's gospel against John's gospel. Certainly John's gospel seems to suggest that Jesus's ministry went on for at least 2.5 years because he has 3 Passover feasts during that time. People often say that Mark has a 1-year ministry, but actually that's not the case. Mark doesn't give any kind of chronology at all. He groups his material together so that he has all the Galilean stuff in the first half, and then a journey to Jerusalem, and then all the Jerusalem material in the second half. That's just because he likes this sort of topical arrangement, but I don't think he's necessarily telling us that it lasted 1 year. So who knows? Both of them, John certainly has theological reasons for wanting to bring Jesus down to Jerusalem quite a lot. But it's quite possible that his ministry lasted several years.
Why do you think that Jesus was crucified? What do you think caused his execution?
Most likely, I think the powers that be just didn't know what he was up to. I think particularly when he went to Jerusalem and he went into the city on a donkey, and people tend to think, oh, that's a sign of humility, but actually in a pilgrimage feast where people are walking, the whole point of a pilgrimage is you walk in. To ride into the city is a sign that you are somebody. that you're riding in some kind of majesty, even if it's a donkey that you're. I mean, everybody moves around in donkeys in the ancient world. It's nothing particularly humble about that. So I think the fact that Jesus rides into Jerusalem is quite a striking act. And then even more so than that, he goes into the temple and he overturns the tables of the money changers, and that's a huge deal. Probably what that's signifying is that he's saying the temple is going to be destroyed. And so you can understand why the chief priests wouldn't like that. But also the Romans would start to get agitated too. Who is this man? Who's this troublemaker? And what's he going to do next? Is he going to disrupt the feast? So I think it's quite likely that both the Jewish high priests and the Roman governor would have had their eye on Jesus and wondered what it was he was up to. And the life of one provincial peasant was not held particularly highly in the ancient world. So if Jesus was causing trouble, the easiest thing for all concerned was simply to get rid of him.
We have a super chat question. Andrew Bawitlung, thank you for your super chat. Did Paul think Jesus is equal to Yahweh?
It's really hard because, it's a really good question and kind of fundamental to the development of early Christianity. Certainly Paul talks about bowing down to Jesus and Jesus being divine. But did he think he was equal to the God of Israel? This just always seems to me like such a massive jump for a first century Jew to make. It's hard to say. I think a lot of people would say yes, he thinks Jesus is equal to Yahweh. I'm not sure whether he would have thought that Jesus was in some way he's divine, but not quite the same as the Yahweh of Israel, the Yahweh of the Old Testament. You have lots of shades of divinity in the ancient world in a way that we just don't have nowadays. For us, that it's God or human, and there's a massive gulf between those two things. Whereas in the ancient world, you had all sorts of semi-divine beings, you had heroes, you had sons of God that might be sort of more than human, but perhaps not quite as much as a god. So I'm not entirely sure that Paul did think of Jesus as being exactly the same as the God of the Old Testament.
What do you think about the response that some give to the Q hypothesis, and they criticize it and say that if Luke knew Matthew, or the other way around, that Matthew knew Luke, it somehow it basically eliminates the need for the hypothetical Q document. But others will say that Q is still necessary, even if Matthew or Luke knew the other. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if one knows the other, then you don't need Q. And I'm all for getting rid of hypothetical sources, particularly when we have no evidence for them. I think my difficulty in that, well, I suppose I have two things about Q. One, the first positive thing about Q is that I think it makes really good sense of how we get two gospels that come after Mark, and both are clearly using Mark, but they also have something else in common, and they use it in the same order with very similar wording. And that just seems to make a lot of sense if you say there's another document that they are using in exactly the same way that they're using Mark. They're just, using it in order and slipping it in. I suppose the difficulty I have if we say, let's get rid of Q and let's just say, I think the most common one is to say that you have Mark and then Matthew, and then Luke comes along and uses both of them. The difficulty with that, I think, is it's things like the birth stories. Why would Luke come up with something so different to Matthew if he has Matthew in front of him? That's not an insurmountable difficulty. It might simply be that he thought Matthew's birth stories didn't really kind of cover the ground he wanted to, and he thought he could do a better job. And he keeps some of the main elements, but just sort of changes everything else. You've also got the same problem at the end with the resurrection accounts. Why does Luke then change Matthew's resurrection appearance in Galilee and decide that all of the appearances are going to be in Jerusalem? Again, you can get around that, and you can say, well, he's planning acts, and so he wants to keep everything in Jerusalem. But I think it becomes more difficult to see why he's making some of the changes to Matthew and yet keeping very, very close to Mark. That seems odd. Whereas with the Q hypothesis, Matthew and Luke are both using Q in the same way that they're using Mark, and somehow that seems to make more sense. So, yeah, I am generally a believer in Q, though I don't. Once people start to kind of build hypothesis on hypothesis and start to work out too much about what these Q people might have been like and what their interests were, I start to kind of drift off a bit.
Joel Pearson, thank you for your super chat. Do we have any eyewitness accounts of Jesus?
And not directly. It depends whether you count Paul as one, I suppose. I mean, Paul was a witness to the risen Jesus. He has this experience on the road to Damascus, and he describes that as an experience of the risen Jesus. So I suppose we have that, but we have no eyewitness accounts of the ministry of Jesus itself. I mean, so again, some people would disagree with everything. Some people, like Richard Borkham, argues that a lot of what we have in the Gospels actually goes back to eyewitnesses, and when names are mentioned, he would suggest that they're mentioned because they're known witnesses, and so a lot of what we have actually goes back to people who saw it themselves, rather than the more common idea amongst scholars that there's been a whole sort of history of oral transmission, whereby one person tells somebody else, and it gets sort of moved along like that. So I think, generally speaking, we don't have any eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. I mean, another possibility, I suppose, is also Mark's gospel, where supposedly it comes from Peter's eyewitness testimony. I'm a little bit more open to that, I think, than some people, particularly if you think Mark comes from Rome, and Peter may have ended up in Rome. I think it's not impossible that Mark's gospel has some kind of connection with Peter, but I don't think that any of the evangelists are really interested in just telling us what happened. They're interested in developing that story in sort of encouraging faith. And so even if they had eyewitness accounts, I think they would still embellish them.
Whisk, thank you for your super chat. I guess he has no question.
He's just got a good name.
Yeah. So what do you think caused the early Christians to believe that Jesus rose from the dead?
Again, a difficult one. I suppose some kind of huge and overriding sense that Jesus was still alive amongst them, perhaps to visionary experiences, as the Gospels suggest. I mean, certainly our earliest accounts of Jesus's resurrection is the one from Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about Jesus appearing to Peter and then other disciples, the 12, and then 500 brethren, he says, and then last of all to him. And certainly when he describes that, you get this sense of, this calling, this being this sort of visionary experience that he has, and that's what convinces him that Jesus is still alive. And that's what the early Christians start to call resurrection. Of course, some people would say that they went down to the tomb on the Sunday morning and they found it was empty. That's really difficult to know what to do with that historically, because our earliest account of the empty tomb, of course, comes from Mark's gospel, which is probably to be dated sometime in the 70s. So that's 40 years after the time of Jesus, and there's no mention of it at all in Paul's writing. Some people suggest that the empty tomb is there to sort of highlight Jesus's physical resurrection, that, you know, he really did come to life again, body and blood and bone in the tomb. But it's also quite likely, in fact, I think more likely, that what Mark is sort of tapping into here is a whole tradition in Greek-Roman and also Jewish writings of righteous people being taken up into heaven, and the disappearance of their body means that they're now in the heavenly realm. So people like Elijah, who was sort of taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, it was later believed that the same happened to Moses, that Moses was also taken up to heaven, where the two of them still are. And you get this a lot in Greek and Roman stories, particularly Romulus, the king, sort of disappeared, and then people started to say he'd gone to heaven and was now a god. So I think what the empty tomb actually shows for Mark is that Jesus is now in heaven, which is exactly what he said to the high priest, that, you know, you will see the Son of Man seated in heaven at the right hand of power. So yeah, I think probably some kind of visionary experience that convinced them that Jesus was still alive in some way.
Whisk, thank you for your super chat. His question is, can you comment on Yahweh dismembering the Nakash as the first act of violence in the canon?
I'm afraid I can't comment on that at all. I'm very much the New Testament rather than the Old, I'm afraid. But I mean, there's certainly plenty of violence in the in the Old Testament. There's some levels of violence in the New Testament too. I mean, when you look at apocalypses and Revelation and things like that. But I'm afraid I can't comment on that at all.
What do you think of the hypothetical sources of M and L, the unique material of Matthew and Luke, respectively?
Yeah, I'm sure they both have a lot of stuff that they bring in their own interests. And if you want to call them the source M for Matthew and the source L for Luke, then that's perfectly fine by me. But I don't suppose that they were one source. I mean, I think M is just the name we give to all of the sort of the special interest material that Matthew puts in there. So that might be his birth narratives. It might be some of the stuff in the Sermon on the Mount. It might be, you know, some of his proof texts from Scripture. Who knows? I mean, these are all the things that Matthew is really interested in. And so he's, of course, going to rewrite the earlier Gospels, Mark and Q, and add in the information and the material that he likes. So I doubt it was any kind of fixed source, either written or oral. I think it probably just refers to, you know, a body of material that Matthew had and liked and wanted to put in.
What kind of person do you think Jesus was? Do you think he was a revolutionary, a prophet, apocalyptic figure?
I think that the sort of the model that for me best captures him is a prophet, quite like the prophets of old in the Old Testament. I mean, they also, I think he was an apocalyptic prophet too, to some extent. But again, a bit like the Old Testament prophets, they often talked about the day of the Lord that's coming, and, you know, it's going to be bad for the rich and those who don't care about the poor. So they had a sense of the future and a future reckoning. And I think that's quite similar in Jesus. It's difficult to know just how apocalyptic Jesus was. Was he super apocalyptic and the church sort of diluted that? I mean, I think there's no doubt that there was a level of dilution as the kingdom didn't come, as God didn't come and wreak retribution on people in judgment. But I do get the impression that perhaps Jesus wasn't quite as sort of apocalyptic as, say, John the Baptist, who seems to be very much telling people, repent, wash yourself in the Jordan, and get ready because it's going to be very soon. So I think the best model for Jesus is these Old Testament prophets, the sort of the Isaiah, Hosea, Micah, Amos, these people who also had very strong social comments as well, but were expecting some kind of day of the Lord in the future.
Do you think Jesus died before John the Baptist or after? And I ask this question because I know that scholars are kind of divided on it because of an analysis of Josephus, and I'll say that Josephus appears to be saying John died after Jesus in contradiction to the gospel, saying it's the other way around.
Yeah, the difficulty is that Josephus's account of John the Baptist is a flashback. So he's talking about a war that Herod Antipas has, and that he loses. And then people say, well, it was because of what he did to John the Baptist. He's getting his comeuppance now. This is all because of what he did. And then Josephus retells the story. So we've actually no idea at all when John the Baptist died, or even really when I suppose we have the account in Luke that tells you when he started. But yeah, I mean, it's just very difficult to know how long John the Baptist's ministry lasted. I mean, the Gospels do suggest that. I mean, I was going to say both John and Mark, but if John knows Mark, then of course that doesn't really hold for very much. But even though John and Mark are different, they both say that either John the Baptist was arrested or he was already dead. Oh no, sorry, no, hold on, scrap that. No, John says that John the Baptist was still going strong, doesn't he, when Jesus starts? So yeah, I suppose we don't really know. I mean, the point for Mark, I think, is very much that he wants to cast John the Baptist as this sort of Elijah figure. So John the Baptist has to have come and finished his ministry. So he's already arrested by the time that Jesus starts. So in Mark's scheme of things, Elijah has come and he's prepared all things, and now he's off the stage and Jesus is about to start. Whereas for John's gospel, he wants to make John the Baptist into the witness for Jesus, and so he has to have the two having a parallel ministry for a little while. But so both of those are theological portrayals, and it's a bit difficult to know the exact sort of chronology of the two.
Which way would you lean towards? John dying before Jesus or after?
I think I would probably lean towards Jesus dying. Sorry, John the Baptist dying before, because it does see it. Because I can understand sort of why the tradition in that case would sort of come about, that people would start to say, well, he was the one that John the Baptist was pointing to. I think it would be a bit more difficult to do that if certainly if John the Baptist's ministry was later than Jesus's, that would be very difficult to do. But even if John the Baptist started his ministry and then carried on for several years, during which time you have Jesus's ministry, and then John the Baptist dies later, I still think it will be more difficult to come up with that idea that that Jesus was the one John was pointing to. It's not a very strong argument, but if you want to know my gut feeling on it, that's what I'd go with.
What are your thoughts on the Gospel of Thomas and in relation to the Q document?
Oh yeah, well, I do tend to follow the people who say that it's 2nd century and it knows the synoptics. I suppose where it's like the Q document, or at least the reconstructed Q document, is that it does seem to be sort of short, mainly sayings of Jesus. There's not much narrative. There's not much sort of broad biographical material in there, though actually there probably is more biographical material in Q, because at least Q seems to be shaped in terms of, you know, the story of the temptation, and the it seems to have a bit of a biographical scheme to it, whereas Thomas doesn't really at all. It just seems to be sayings. But I mean, so clearly you did get this kind of genre of sayings of Jesus that circulated, and people probably read them out and read them to themselves and memorized them, and you know, liked having them. And you get them as early as the Q document, maybe in the 60s, and as late as Thomas and beyond. But I don't think there's any particular connection between Thomas and Q, other than they're the same kind of literature.
And what are your thoughts on the Testimonium Flavianum?
Well, like most people, I think it is certainly been tampered with by Christians. I mean, the difficulty with Josephus, of course, is that it was Christians who preserved the works of Josephus. Jews hated him and didn't want anything to do with him, you know, the terrible traitor. And so it's Christians who are preserving Josephus's writings, and they like him because he mentions some of these characters from the Gospels, but also particularly because he describes the terrible things that happened in Jerusalem during the siege, and Christians are already starting to say this is divine retribution for what the Jewish authorities have done to Jesus. So they're copying him, and they're reading him and liking him, but I think Josephus couldn't have been too negative to Jesus. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have wanted to keep his work at all. So I do think Josephus said something about Jesus, and probably fairly neutral. But there are certainly bits in the Testimonium Flavianum that can't possibly have come from Josephus. That little bit that says he was the Christ. And he appeared, you know, on the 3rd day, risen from the dead. If it's right to call him a man. I mean, all of these things that clearly are things that are written into the margin by Christian scribes and editors, and gradually sort of get put into the main body of the text. But I think what is probably quite likely is that there was also something that's been taken out, because in the section of the Antiquities where we find the Testimonium Flavianum, it's in amongst a series of tumults from the time of Pilate. So I'm fairly sure that that this particular account also told the story of some kind of tumult. Most likely, I think from the Gospels, the most likely thing is that it's something to do with Jesus's activities in the temple, or something else that we just don't know about. And for whatever reason, the early Christian copyists didn't like this, and so they took it out. But I would give a lot of money to find the original version of Josephus. If that could be found in a cave somewhere, in a pot, that would be really interesting. And from a historical point of view, again, to have something that comes from somebody who's not a follower of Jesus, but seems to be relatively open-minded, as he is with John the Baptist. To have this from Josephus would be pretty amazing.
And what are your thoughts on women disciples?
Well, I think Jesus had them. I think there's clearly evidence for quite a lot of women disciples. The difficulty is that we put all the emphasis on the 12 men who clearly were important during the lifetime of Jesus, during the ministry, but who drop out very, very quickly. And I think the reason they're important in the lifetime of Jesus is that, again, going back to this idea of Jesus as a prophet, he's a prophet of national renewal. So he walks the extent of the kingdom as it was in the days of David and Solomon. You know, he goes right up to Tyre. He goes to the Decapolis. He sort of walks the boundaries of the kingdom, and he also has 12 men who represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So, and of course, in the time of Jesus, there were only 2 tribes left. So this is a very strong symbol that says, you know, Israel will be reconstituted as it was in the great glory days of old. So the 12 are important from that point of view, but that doesn't mean that they're the only disciples that Jesus had. And quite often you get references to disciples where it's clearly people in addition to the 12. So there's plenty of references to people like Mary and Martha that Jesus goes and visits. In Luke 8, we actually hear the names of some women who are going around with the male disciples. So there's Mary Magdalene, there's Joanna, there's Salome. And these women are mentioned right at the end by Mark too, who says, you know, they were with him in Galilee and they'd come to Jerusalem with him. So that there's women on the road as well with Jesus. It's not just that, you know, he goes to visit them in their homes or they're part of the crowd, but they're actually there on the road with him. And when you think about it, I mean, that's how it must have been, because Jesus and 12 men could not have gone and evangelized women in their homes or women washing their clothes by the river. Anywhere where there's gatherings of women, it would have been thought of as, you know, improper for somebody like Peter to go and touch them. So you would have needed a whole sort of regiment of women as well, perhaps under the leadership of Mary Magdalene, because she's the one whose name we hear the most. It's also possible that her name may not mean that she's from the town of Magdala, but Migdal means the great or tower. So it might mean that she's this kind of tower woman, and she's the leader of this bunch of women whose job it is to go and evangelize other women and to baptize them and to put oil on them and to hold their hands, all things that men couldn't do. So I think it's almost certain that Jesus had female disciples, even though we only catch little glimpses of them here and there.
And how would you deal with the different tomb stories that we have in the Gospels, the different resurrection accounts?
Well, I'm not too worried by that. I mean, as I said, I think the most likely thing is that people had experiences of the risen Jesus that they couldn't explain any other way than to say, you know, he's still alive. And I think almost by definition, those are going to be very varied and hard to pin down. So some people saw him as a person, some people saw blinding lights. You get reports of these visions taking place in different parts of Galilee and Judea. And I think that in a way, I think the lack of coherence there seems to me to suggest a greater historical truth than if it all been the same, if they'd all said exactly the same thing as Paul does in 1 Corinthians 15, you know, first to Peter and then to James and then to the 12. You might have started to think, they've all shared their story here. But the fact that, Matthew and Luke know Mark, John probably knows all of them, and yet again he chooses the resurrection stories he wants to use. Just underlines the fact, I think, that there were lots of lots of similar but different stories circulating, which simply, suggested to people that they'd all basically seen the same phenomenon, and that meant that Jesus was still alive.
And what do you think that Jesus' main message was to his followers?
I think the kingdom of God is coming, and get ready for it. So not hugely different, perhaps, to John the Baptist, but I think there was a broader sort of canvas in terms of getting ready for it, and it perhaps wasn't quite so imminent. But certainly the arrival of the kingdom of God, I think, is the strongest message there, and also this sort of topsy-turvy way of looking at honor and shame. So Jesus explains a bit more about what the kingdom of God is like, and it's a kingdom, it's a place, it's a realm, it's living under the kingship of God, where people aren't striving for honor and glory, and they're not sort of doing down other people, but they're all denying themselves. They're all willing to be a servant, willing to be a slave. They're renouncing all honor and glory, and that would have been very countercultural in an ancient context.
Well, thanks for joining me today once again, Dr. Bond.
Thank you. Pleasure to chat.
And I thank everybody for their super chats earlier. Really appreciate it. I'll see everybody later. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.